Okay, I think we can make a start. So welcome to another session of our Theological Education Conference. This is our panel discussion on class in theological education, intersections and experiences. And we have three panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment. And we're going to start with each of them in turn speaking for 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll have a brief period when they talk to each other and ask questions of each other. And then we'll open it up for Q&A from any participant using the same system that we were using this morning, which I'll introduce again, using the chat function so you can see whether you want to ask a question, and I'll be chairing that. So our three panelists, we have Sophie Cowan, we have Anthony Reddy, and we have Grace Thomas. Sophie is a curate at St Giles Desborough. Anthony is director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture at Regent's Park College in Oxford. And Grace is a priest currently serving in Moss Side and Whalley Range in Manchester. All three of them have many other things that I could have said about them as well, but rather than listening to me talking about them, I'm going to hand over and you can hear them talking, which is much more interesting. So I'm going to, first of all, bring up Sophie and hide myself. And Sophie, we will be in your hands. You'll need to unmute, but over to you.
Great, thank you so much. As you can see, the title of my talk today is Classless and Training for Ministry. So I'm just going to get straight into it and hope that you get to know me through it. And I look forward to the questions in the Q&A afterwards. So I'm starting with a poem. It's complicated, class and place. I guess I'm mistaken, thinking of God and all of space. The one who made the stars, knows our names, calls us good, but we're not quite good, are we? Tattooed and pierced as we speak words crumbling into one another, bulking down truth that must be said with love, or we're angry and hard to understand. Perhaps I'll rephrase it, say it like a middle-class man. Ah, but you don't like that we see through the veil. We get up, though we fail, and we fail to meet the mark you assume is yours to make. Dear church, I want to tell you, I'm afraid to say, you're fake. Eternal optimism does not bring God glory, or bragging, story after story. It's complicated, class and place, but not so much that we don't see the face of those who know their greed comes at a price. Precarious, you say? Well, that's really nice. Wonderful, lovely, aren't we all? Not favoured and working class. That's not our call. Class is controversial, that's what they say. Apparently we Brits have a classless society. When Francis first spoke to me about this conference, I was still reeling from my auntie's suicide. I won't go into the details because, of course, it's a very difficult topic, and the Samaritans are a key place to get support if this is something that impacts you directly or indirectly. The reason I mention it is because my upbringing, my teenage and then adult life, has always included the reality of being at the desperate end of working class. I'm not able to wash off my working classness, and this is what it seems polite society, the kind overwhelmingly present within the church, would seem to prefer. Recently it was suggested in the Church Times that my kind of working class would be better described as the precariat, an attempt to cut the working class into smaller, manageable chunks, to know who exactly is on the margins. But whose margin is it? Is it the edge of middle-class Britain? Or are we actually a group of people who could more easily be described as working class because, after all, that is what we call ourselves? In my opinion, working class can include those with a working class heritage, i.e. those who have parents or guardians who were employed in jobs that start and may continue indefinitely on the lowest wages in this country. A working class background, i.e. worked in a low income job, moved into a middle class lifestyle, though is not socially middle class, might be another option. Or working class in the straightforward sense, i.e. has the kind of jobs you can't pretend is middle class. Those of us who are cleaners, shopkeepers, factory workers, fast food servers, labourers. The kinds of jobs that tend to be physical, and the pay almost always starts very low. I'm not saying working class equals poor. I know many in trades who earn more than my middle class friends could ever earn, but I know very few middle class people who could provide that skilled labour, and even fewer who would be willing to do it in the conditions many working class people have to. And I include in this the unemployed who aspire to get one of those labour-intensive jobs, but can't because of ill health or any other number of factors. Mortality rates in the working class estates I've served in across the country are 10 years different to those in the nearby middle/upper class areas. So those working class people are more likely to die around the age of 71 rather than 81. I've noticed this in my curacy. People here live to be 90, even past 100. It's completely unheard of where I come from, which is only 6 miles away. It's not really that complicated, and I think it's a shame that the church so often does not have the integrity to see what its structures continue to allow and what they represent. When I was 14, I was working in a shop on the weekends. By the time I was 16, I'd been chucked out of the family home and was living with my boyfriend and his dad. I had worn down shoes and was earning the child's version of minimum wage, which is basically not very much. I made a comment to the manager of the shop one day about a customer after they'd left the shop. I perceived him to be middle class from his entitled behaviour. One of the staff said to me, "You are obsessed with class." Well, she didn't say class like ass. She said class like arse, and I've noticed Christians, among others, want to do the same kind of move. I know who I am, and on the council estates where I'm from, or elsewhere in the country, people know if I'm being honest about that or not. There is no shame in it for me. I enjoy the plain-speaking quick wit, the deep and life-giving friendships that come from my community. I've stepped briefly into the middle and even upper class world, and I perceive both good and bad there too. But let's not pretend the differences don't exist. So I want to hear the voices of working class leaders, unashamed, unsquashed bodies, tattoos and slang, trackies and trainers. Some will say I'm presenting a stereotype, and I'll respond. Go to the estates. Tell them they're not working class. Tell them it's complicated. Tell them that church is a classless institution. I think you'd find an interesting set of responses. I want to share with you now some voices from my research. And first I'll just say, I've been able to pass in middle class circles because of my education. And so before I talk about this master's dissertation at Oxford, I want to tell you the running slogan that I have, and I'd have it printed on a t-shirt if I could be bothered to get it printed. It's this: education doesn't belong to the middle class. So my MTH dissertation is supervised by Helen Cameron. She's brilliant. And for participants, I advertised asking working class people to contribute their thoughts to the title Working Class Opinions on the Church of England's Approach to Estate Ministry. I interviewed 23 people, firstly in focus groups. Then I went away and drew a summary of what was said. And there was a follow-up focus group where we met in order to make sure that what I had concluded matched what they wanted to say. After that, I met with 4 participants one-to-one for 1-hour interviews. From all of this, a variety of themes and patterns emerged, though for the purpose of this talk, I'll focus on the comments that related to leadership in the Church of England. So I've drawn from 8 participants only because we'd be here all day otherwise. So participant 1 said, "You need someone who is committed. I think we've had 3 youth workers since the one who'd been here for years and years left. There's just no consistency. I would call that a jump in, jump out church. There's no sustainability." This is common, I suppose, across churches, the idea that people want people who will stay around, who stick around. But if you consider it from the perspective of people living on estates, this is not just the church's attitude to the area. This is teachers and police and all of those social structures that aren't actually present and steady in the society, in the culture around us. They're constantly moving and changing within a people group, within an area of a people group who tend to stay where they are, where location really matters. Participant 2. The vicar's middle class. He likes to think he's not, but he is. He is trying though. There wasn't this kind of distaste for the middle class, which I think sometimes is imagined to be the case on estates. But there was a sense that integrity is often lacking. As I said to you before, we could go down the kind of trying to give definitions and descriptions of what class is, but working class people do know. And it's not helpful to pretend otherwise. So, of course, say you've got a working class background, working class heritage, but if you're not working class, then it's not really that helpful to say that you are. Also, the kind of things that were coming out along the lines of middle class vicars was so much more about kind of friendship, the ideas of family, how different they were across the 2 cultures. And so that's something that really needs careful consideration. Participant 3. The vicar has a Liverpool accent, and I think that helps because he doesn't sound middle class. He is educated and experienced and stuff like that, but it doesn't come across like that at all, which I think is a good thing. This was interesting, particularly because some of those training for ministry who had Liverpool accents were told to kind of improve their pronunciation and not to speak with those accents, which is problematic on so many levels, but particularly if you're thinking that in terms of those on estates, a northern accent is actually deemed as something that people can really get on board with. What they were struggling with were people with what they would consider to be posh accents, i.e. those people who would elevate themselves above those people on estates. Whether that's true or not, that was what was coming out of the research. Participant 4. The leadership style in my experience was autocratic, and people were on rotas for the readings and occasionally prayers. Full participation was not encouraged. This came out time and time again. The idea that you can come at the front because we want to show someone from your estates, or you can come and be involved if you've got a success story, if you've turned your life around, if you've stopped taking drugs, if you've got yourself a steady job. These are things that we actually heard in the research, but to be a full participating leader, to be someone who's on the face of what the church is doing, at the face of what the church is doing, these things were not accepted or not encouraged at the very least. Participant 5. When we take a particular attitude into estates, when people have almost gone on to estates to save them. People on estates are super deprived, must lead miserable lives, need the church to save them from all the problems, coming in with a messiah complex and will solve all your problems. This was a constant theme, and it's a constant theme in the literature actually, when you look at what's been printed about estates ministry or working class ministry, that we need this transformation within us, that if only we could overcome all the evils that we are involved in. And it's known. People know that that's the approach that the church is taking towards them. And of course, we all need the transformation of Christ, in my opinion, as a Christian. That's what I believe. But I don't think that that is specific to people on working class housing estates. And neither do the participants. Participant 6. Largely collaborative in terms of what ministry was going on in estates. That's what this participant's talking about. It was largely collaborative. An incredible willingness to come alongside people and encourage them to develop and explore. On the one occasion that I personally saw someone with a much more authoritarian leadership style, it did not have a positive response or outcome. And I think that is really interesting, the fact that the Church of England, as far as I'm aware, does not have specific training for estates ministry. And so the idea that an authoritarian style of leadership is extremely problematic on an estate isn't news to me, and it wasn't news to the participants, but I think it might be something that the church isn't entirely aware of. People on estates generally don't have any issue with an egalitarian outlook, with the idea that we're all equal. It's kind of a normal idea in my experience and from the research that took place. Participant 7. Given how our identity is formed very early in life, I think if you identify as a working class person, that should be enough, even if your circumstances have changed radically. So this again is kind of a point towards the church, not just the church, society generally, trying to chop up those categories of what working class is, and then to be a leader you need to distance yourself from it. What actually came, I haven't included it here, but really interestingly or worryingly, the wealthier people were within the working class kind of setting, the more acceptable they were to be considered for ministry or upfront ministry leadership, what have you. And this is evident in the church generally, but also you think about what we're asking people to do in training institutions, what we wear when we preach, how much we have to engage with emails and that kind of online world, which involves having a laptop. I'm not saying working class people don't have laptops. I've got a laptop, but some don't. And so it's interesting again that there's this kind of delineation between what kind of working class you are and what's acceptable. And this person wanted to say that they had been encouraged to distance themselves from that background. And I would say it's really important that we come at our work as ministers knowing our positionality and being open about it, and questioning where there is a need for, where there's an expectation that we would pretend. And I did hear that up and down the scales, the hierarchies in the Church of England, different people have spoken to me who are working class, A common theme is pretense. I'm pretending to be something other than what I actually am, were things that is a common comment that I've heard doing this research. And finally, participant 8, ministers with doctor in their title, representing an academic elite, PhD at Oxford. Do ministry candidates get diversity training that includes class? This is some of that, I hope, and that's wonderful. I'm so pleased that Common Awards are doing it. But as far as I'm aware, this is one of the only pieces of training, diversity training, that includes class. Maybe I'm wrong. If you can point me in the direction of other resources, I would be so pleased to read them. So finally, resources. They're all here. I think the slides are going to be available, but these are the ones I would suggest. National Estates Church Network is an obvious one to go to. They're doing learning pathways and jobs for working class people. They also commissioned Blessed Are the Poor by Laurie Green, which is very good. And then Working Class Christians, which was a result of the research that I did, but there were other members of that group who set up a Facebook group, and now we're kind of having more and more people join, which is amazing, and to kind of encourage one another. Of course, there's been some backlash and some people saying, why do you need Working Class Christians group? But I hope that the research has gone some way to explain that. There are some other websites on there that are available, and At Estate Ministry is the Twitter account that I tweet from. Other literature I would recommend, Poverty Safari by Darren McGarvey. It's political, not theological, but it shows the point when people want the sob stories, but they don't want to hear your opinions on theology or politics or whatever else, but they want to hear how hard your life was and how it's transformed. And then Theology by Heart, which is Ellen Clark King. She includes the voices of working class women on Northern Estates. And then Chavs by Owen Jones, which is the demonisation of the working class. Sorry to whiz through them, but I want to leave you on a bit of a positive and not just a kind of constant critique with this prayer that I've written. And I hope you will join me as I say these words. I speak now to the God who knows our motives, who sees the potential in those who have been diminished. Ignite in your church a desire to put aside all that is fake and lacking integrity, and the will to listen to those voices that have been made small and still. I speak now to the God who knows our greed, who perceives the motives of our hearts. My God, why have we forsaken you? I speak now to the God who expects to meet our eyes as we look into the faces of those who have been excluded. Call us again to humility and enable us, your church, to dare to go on that journey with you. In Christ we pray. Amen.
Sophie, thank you so much for that. Lots there for us to come back to, but we're going to move on to our second speaker. So if you'll bear with me just while I arrange the spotlighting. Just actually, Jill, is it worth switching now? We're close enough to half an hour. So let me also do that before handing over to Anthony. Sorry about the slightly clunky transition. Anthony, we're in your hands now.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to get to share a few words with you this afternoon on an issue, I guess, that has been underexplored for far too long within the context of theological education. First to say that I did have a PowerPoint, and I'm happy to make that available afterwards. But about 2 o'clock, I was sat reflecting, praying if you wish, And it sort of occurred to me that, actually, I'm not going to do a presentation. I'm just going to share a short story in a previous piece of work. That's largely because I think sometimes when we're doing presentations, it's as much about sort of trying to show our sense of accomplishment, and our sense of validity and legitimacy in terms of being able to speak. And to be honest with you, I've been around long enough and I'm ugly enough not to have to pretend that I need any of those props. So I'm just gonna share a story and some reflections on a previous piece of work, but just to show that none of this is new. So first, very brief story. As many of you know, I was born and brought up in God's own city of Bradford in West Yorkshire. And the school I went to was called Tong Upper School, or Tong Comprehensive School. It was a large state comprehensive that at any given time had about 2,000 children in there. So I use the word school in the loosest possible sense of the word. It was more like a zoo than a school. And at any given time of the 2,000 children there, approximately 1,900 did not want to be there. So there was a small number of relative swats, including myself, who quite liked school. Bradford was one of those places that was part of a socialist experiment in the 60s, in that the council abolished grammar schools. So we had no grammar schools and no 11 plus. So what tended to happen in schools like Tong was that due to rigid streaming, you had a school within a school. So if you were in Band 1, which I was in, Band 1 was effectively the grammar school within the comprehensive school. If you were in Bands 2 and 3, you were in what was seen as the old style secondary modern, and to an extent there was no expectation that you'd get any education from that and you would leave without qualifications and work in factories. So here's the thing. So in the Reddy family, 4 siblings, I'm the eldest. Second is my younger brother Richard, who some of you know, who works for CTBI. Then there's my brother Chris, who's the most rebellious of the 3, and I'll get back to him in a moment. And then the youngest is Sandra, she's the baby of the family. If you talk to us about our experiences of Tong school, you'll get 2 clear different narratives. If you speak to me, I will tell you it was a fantastic school, that they pushed me, they encouraged me to work hard. I got to university and I did a degree in church history, largely through the support and the aegis of the school. If you speak to my 3 younger siblings, particularly Chris, who was the third of the boys and third in the order, they will give you a different narrative. They'll tell you it was oppressive, it was judgmental, it was hyper class conscious, and it failed them. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, here's the difference between our experiences. That I succeeded not because I was cleverer than my younger siblings, that's not the case at all. I succeeded because I was deferential, I was good at mimicry, so I learned how to adopt the social mores of the kind of learning that they wanted from us, which was to be passive, to imbibe, and not to comment, not to critique, to know our place. And then thirdly, about inauthenticity, I just dispensed with any sense of trying to be myself, because I knew that myself was not what they wanted. What they wanted was a creature who would be conformed and controlled in their likeness. That was Tong Upper School. It seems to me that if we're going to talk about class and if we're going to be honest about the whole development of theological education, we need to hold those things in mind to say, firstly, in terms of theological education and particularly formation for ministry, it's all about deference in all our respective churches. It is about mimicry. And I echo all the things that Sophie has said before in the previous talk about learning to adopt a particular style, a particular way of being, a particular set of mannerisms that are not about being working class, they're about trying to find yourself within the framework and the composite of your social betters. Of course, it's hierarchical. That goes without saying. So even those of egalitarianism are still within the framework of particular power relations and those who control power, and those who have the power to represent God most ultimately. And then, of course, last of all, it is not about authenticity. It's not about being yourself, particularly if yourself is cast in the wrong mode. All that to say that one of the things I found interesting when I was preparing for this was I went back to my library and I found this book here called Nobody's to Somebody. So lest anyone think I'm making a blatant plug for a book for you to buy, this book was published in 2003, long out of print. So like there are some very, very vague vague old copies available on Amazon and some other places for extortionate prices, but Nobody's to Somebody's is long gone. But in that, I think it's in the penultimate chapter, I have an exercise called Redefining the Norm that I used to use a lot, but haven't done for a long time, although I might pick it up again of late. And the exercise works as follows. Split a teaching group into two halves. Both groups have the same exercise to do. And so the exercise is, there's a story that is made up of nine boxes. So basically, like there are 9 vignettes, 9 brief statements, not in any particular order. And each group, well, the first group has to reassemble those 9 boxes into a linear order that tells a story that can be interpreted. So their task is twofold. Firstly, is to try and put the story together, and then secondly, to interpret the story for meaning. That's the first group, Group A. Group B have the same exercise, except they start with the deficit that they only have 5 of the 9 boxes anyway. So they have triple jeopardy. So firstly, they have to work out what bits of the story they don't have, because they only have 5 of the 9 pieces. Then secondly, they have to put the story together. Thirdly, they then have to interpret the story for meaning. And you set both groups off. And you explain to the second group that they don't have all the story. They only have 5 of the 9 pieces. Therefore, the first thing they have to try and do is to work out what they don't have, put the story together and interpret it. So they have an extra layer of deficit they're working with compared to group 1. And off they go. In the times I used to do this exercise, as I said, I haven't done it for well over 15 years now. What I remember, 2 outcomes were always interesting. First with group 1, that even though they had all the pieces to put the story together, the story is written in such a way that it's not obvious where the pieces go. So, but what happens is that because they believe they have all the pieces, they spend a disproportionate amount of time being tied up with the exactitude of how the story should go. Does this bit go before the other bit? And normally they end up falling out with each other as they argue over what bits go where, because they think that they should be able to tell the story properly because they have all the bits, all 9 parts. Group 2 quickly work out that because they only have 5 of the 9 bits, it's pointless trying to write and trying to tell the story in a supposedly official way. So they quickly dispense with that. And then what they do is that they create a story that is interesting. So with the bits they don't have, they think all kinds of things into the story. And invariably, when you get the 2 groups together to tell you what the story is, and more importantly, what is its meaning, group 2 with only parts of it always end up with a story that is much more life-giving, much more transformative, much more challenging than the first group who thought that they had all the bits and then got tied up over what went where and what was the official bit. Clearly, it's a metaphor. And therefore, when I used to use this in the classrooms, when I used to teach at the Queen's Foundation many, many moons ago and in other places, that as a reflection on both access of both accounts of the story, what always struck me was that as a metaphor for race and class, in the first one, what you nearly had were those who came from positions of some type of entitlement and acceptability. They ended up reproducing a sterile narrative because they were so intent upon trying to master the story, trying to get the official version right, trying to control it, that they missed the point, which was, in the end, stories are not about whether it's absolutely right or wrong. It's actually about how did they make us feel? What did they generate within us? How did they talk about deeper truths rather than A follows B, follows C, follows D? Mostly, if you tell a story like that, people fall asleep. If you find a way of getting into the very heart of what matters the most, whether it's literally true or not, that then brings life. I say all that to say that it seemed to me that one of the issues I was wrestling with all those years ago when on the staff of a theological college that trained people for the Methodist ministry, the Church of England, and the United Reformed Church, was that most of the people who came to us were in Group A. They felt that they were in possession of all the pieces, that they had been schooled in places like Tom's School and in much more prestigious places in order to believe a sense of entitlement about being there. And most times what they ended up then arguing about were these attitudes about who should hold positions of power, who should be more important than whom. There's something depressing about teaching a group of ordinands, and already like you can sort of see the men deciding who's going to end up being an archdeacon and who's going to end up being a bishop. And you want to shout some expletive at them saying, really? Is that really what you think matters at this moment in time as you're training? Seriously? Occasionally we get someone in Group B. And the main problem we had was that they were starting at a deficit. But I like the exercise where you know that you don't have all the pieces. Oftentimes they were not even told that. So they were playing catch up in a construct that they thought was egalitarian, that was anything but. There was already a head start for particular groups of people who, as I said, ended up arguing around the exactitudes of how this should go and can I master it, rather than how do I find a way of interpreting this that becomes life-giving for me and for others. It's not for nothing that the most radical aspects of Christianity have always come from the bottom up, never the top down. They've always come from those people who know that they don't possess all the story. They know that they don't have all the pieces all around which they can affect a sense of mastery. So therefore what they do is that in the light of their lived experience and their imagination, they create things that are life-giving and transformative. It's not for nothing that liberation theology, its roots in Latin America in terms of a class analysis, come from the poor, not the rich. It's not for nothing that the power of Black liberation theology comes from people whose descendants were enslaved Africans, who also knew how to speak into a construct where you don't have all the pieces. And in the end, all you have is your power of your imagination and the sense of your being in order to try and fill in the gaps. It's not for nothing that it's from feminism that it's the power of women, if we're honest, predominantly white middle-class women, but even so, even amongst poorer working-class women, there has been this sense of you can't see patriarchy unless you're on the B side, where you don't have all the bits of the story and it's glaringly obvious. If you have been cushioned by patriarchy all your life, then essentially male and masculine privilege is akin to being a fish in the sea and assuming that the water is normative because you know nothing else. So going back to the exercise was really quite heartening and depressing in equal measures. It was heartening because I've often worked on the basis that I don't want to go back and look at the things I wrote 20 years ago because I'm convinced it was pretty crap and I'd be embarrassed by it. And I'm so much better now. And so I'd rather not look back. And so therefore, when I looked at Nobody's to Somebody's, I was actually quite surprised that I thought of this exercise because it still works. But on the other hand, I was depressed because that exercise came out of my doctoral studies. The book was published in 2003, so it's 18 years old. and is still relevant. I wish it wasn't. I wish that we had changed, but of course we haven't. And so therefore, as I look at the time and I want to sum up, I want to suggest some very obvious things that we need to be aware of if we want to be serious about engaging with class and issues of race within the construct of theological education. Firstly, we've got to be honest about power. Let's not pretend that there is an egalitarianism in terms of ecclesial structures. Yes, there is in the gospel, but let's be honest with you. The gospel and the church are not the same things. They never have been and never will be. And therefore, we may not be able to change issues of power and hierarchy and deference and the need for mimicry. In which case, and let's just be honest about it, that those things are central to the self-understanding of how we have done church in the prism of Christendom. Secondly, part of the power of those in B who don't have possession of all the pieces of the story and they have to use their own experience and imagination to fill in the gaps is that tells us something about the power of phronesis. That I believe it was Aristotle who spoke about this sense of there being different types of knowledge. And the problem is that different types of knowledge are often framed in hierarchy. It's not that there are different types of knowledge, it's the fact that we see them hierarchically. So at the top is epistemology. So those of us who can write stuff down, those of you who can go to college and write essays with references, what you're engaging in is epistemology. It has its place, of course it does. I'd be a hypocrite to critique it when that's how I earn my living. I teach and I do epistemology. But of course, it's only one type of knowledge. The second is technicae, from which we get the word technical, which obviously is part of what theological education is about. It's the ability to know how to do something, how to master something. But ultimately, what Aristotle says is that the real knowledge often is phronesis, which is practical wisdom. Practical wisdom that comes from experience is a great phrase in Jamaican speak where we talk about who feels it knows it. Who feels it knows it. There is something authentic about feeling something and experiencing it. And from that, you know a kind of truth that is not abstract. It's not something that is intellectualized. It just comes from the visceral reality of life. Those in B know what that is because it's that allows them to create the gaps in the narrative of the pieces that they've been given. And then finally, if we're really serious, we have to examine our conceptual norms. And by that, I mean that there's a kind of template that we still work to. And our template is still largely heterosexual, young Oxbridge males. That is still tends to be the default position in terms of what the church sees in its ideal candidate. And then basically, the further away from that you move, the more problematic and more transgressive you become. It's why the church still struggles with the changes in demographics. Most of our theological education is predicated on the basis of those particular types of candidates. And therefore, if, for example, you're a Black, single, working class mother who turns up to train, we're still not quite sure what to do with you because you don't represent the norm that we're still conceptually working with, even though we say otherwise in terms of all the different provisions and the different pathways that we have created, which I will give credit to that. But even now, there is still a sense in which, for all those different ways, the real proper way is to turn up, train residentially at a college and do a degree in 3 years that leaves you perfectly educated, well-reformed, schooled in deference and mimicry, and probably taught not to be yourself. Thank you very much.
Anthony, thank you for that. And again, lots that we are going to come back to in the discussion. But at this stage, I'm going to switch the spotlights and bring in Grace, and we'll also switch interpreters at the same time. So bear with me for a few seconds.
Hello, everybody. I'll just try and get this slideshow to start. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just do that. There we go. So hello, everybody. I come to this talk with many different thoughts, which don't always align, but still felt important. My talk is rooted in my lived, embodied experience of a minister on the ground. And I'm going to talk about race and class and inequality, mission and theological education. So it's a buffet of thoughts, if you will. So I'm going to start with an image that came to mind when I read Wilder Gaffney's fantastic book, Womanist Midrash. And in the opening chapter, Gaffney talks about the hospitality of her Southern heritage and invites us to join her table. When I would visit India for dinner, my grandma and my aunties would offer up a selection of vegetarian curries with maybe chapatis or idlis or rice. And together they'd make up a meal that had distinctive parts, more like a series of dishes that together hopefully complement each other. Some of the dishes maybe, so today what I'm going to do, is offer a meal of sorts. Again, hopefully with dishes that complement each other. Some of the dishes may be too spicy, some may need more flavour. It's an experimental selection. It's a recipe which is constantly being tweaked. The picture that you see is St James Moss Side in Manchester. It's one of the churches that I serve in. On Sundays, we have two services, a morning one with around 40 people of all ages from 2 to 90 and many different backgrounds. We have a large number of attendees from the Windrush generation. Historically, Moss Side was one of the few churches in the area who were welcoming to Black people moving to Manchester in the 50s and onwards, which reflects a wider story of painful exclusion. And the church is also home to local people, white working class people, people who've moved from India to work in the local hospital. We're very near one of the biggest hospitals in Manchester. So in the afternoon, we have a Marathi language service as well. When I arrived in Moss Side 3 years ago as a shiny new curate, I came already with a reputation of someone who's interested in eco-activism. And the congregation immediately started talking to me about how this was an interest they wanted to develop. To cut a long story short, we were the first urban eco-church in the diocese and the first to receive a silver award. So I present to you, hopefully you can see this, an eco brick. There we are, let's see if we can see this. So this eco brick is basically a bottle, a plastic bottle that's filled with all the kinds of plastic, so film, crisp packets, that kind of thing, that cannot be recycled at the curbside. And you pack the plastic in really tight, often employing the use of a long stick to really shove the plastic down. I know the woman who made this. She's in her 70s, and she spent hours pushing each bit of plastic waste down to make a solid, dense brick, the product of her hard work. Back in 2019, the church that I serve in Moss Side, this church here, we wanted to build a structure, but we had no money. And someone came up with the idea of eco bricks, which fitted beautifully with the eco-church movement, which was growing in the church. I calculated that we need at least 100 bricks. Each brick is a story of hard work. They take a long time to make. I make on average about one a month. And we started an eco brick campaign in Moss Side from our church. The response was tremendous. In less than 6 months, we had 150 bricks. 150 bricks made faithfully by people of all ages. And then the pandemic hit. And in Moss Side, it hit hard, as it did in many places. We lost dear congregation members. In pre-pandemic times, hundreds would have crowded to their funeral and held each other in grief. As it was, a handful were permitted at the graveside. The eco bricks took residence in the cupboards in church as we grieved and tried to serve and care for each other. A couple of months ago at PCC, I raised the issue of the eco bricks again, and we agreed it would be great to build a raised flower bed with them, and at the front of the church, at the front of this bit here, where we could hopefully grow edible food that we could all enjoy, the residents could enjoy. Moss Side has very little green space. Most of the housing is red brick terrace with small yards. So this was a way of using bricks that so many had helped to make to serve the locality and to turn this dead, polluting plastic into life. I agreed to meet up with one of our congregation members who could help to plan the gardening aspect of this, because gardening is not my forte. Originally, there would have been at least 2 more that would have joined us, but COVID had claimed them. So this would serve to be a memory for them too, a gift in memory for them. So we met up last week and we had a chat, and suddenly we realised a big problem with our plan. You see, this church in Moss Side resides on one of the busiest roads into Manchester. It's the route many commuters take from the suburban, middle-class areas, more affluent areas, into the city. Indeed, the roads of Moss Side act as a free car park during the day for many 4x4s and luxury cars, for people who don't want to pay for parking in the city and are happy to walk the last 10 minutes in. The air quality around the church, therefore, is toxic. So toxic, it has been deemed illegally dangerous. A school up the road fights a constant battle at the moment between needing to open the windows to let in cooling air and circulate the air in COVID times, and the fact that doing this means that they're letting the air in, which might actually do more damage to the lungs than if they kept the windows shut. So how could we grow edible food in such an environment? Would the food be safe? We're currently researching this further, and it looks like we'll opt for wildflowers instead. This eco-brick, therefore, reveals a story of structural inequality that impacts on the bodies and lived experiences of people in Moss Side. First, the huge surge of interest in the eco-bricks was because people didn't want to chuck their plastic in the bin. They wanted it to be recycled. But because curbside recycling wasn't an option, and the only places to recycle it was either at the council tip or a few select supermarkets, the nearest of which at the moment is an hour's walk away, and there's no direct bus route, this is a place where car ownership is well below the national average. So there were no options until now to recycle or use that plastic. The eco-brick also reminded us of the losses and the health issues that we'd endured in the last 18 months. The demographics of Moss Side, hugely diverse, and the levels of deprivation and crowded inequalities and health inequalities were already present pre-pandemic and came into the fore during the pandemic. And then this eco-brick tells a story about air poisoned by people who don't live in the area, which, as research demonstrates, causes physical and mental ill health and can shorten life expectancy. The ability to breathe is being hampered by such inequality, a familiar and tragic story. On the surface of it, this eco-brick tells a story that confirms the narrative of many a person who has heard of Moss Side but never visited it. A run-down, deprived, working-class place, rife with problems and devoid of hope. When I accepted accuracy, people who didn't live in the area but knew of it because of the headlines, some of which were 40 years old, about gang violence and poverty, would joke about how I would need a bulletproof vest. They admired my bravery for going to such a place. They talked about the things that I could do there. One clergy colleague recently expressed real concern for me when I talked about how I regularly walked around the streets of Moss Side. This popular narrative is not the true story of Moss Side. The eco-brick shows that too, the enthusiasm to engage with an eco-project, the fact that normally a whole community would come out to grieve and support each other. Speak to Moss Siders and yes, of course you'll hear about the challenges. This is not unique to this area though, but you'll also hear many stories of a proud and vibrant community. Now, in a previous talk that I heard, my fellow panellist here, Anthony Reddy, quoted James Cone's assertion that theology is autobiography. And I cannot argue with that. Our theology is embodied in our own lived experience, just as is how we interpret situation and places. I need to locate myself in this presentation here. I am middle class, cisgendered, straight, and do not have a disability. And therefore I know that I view the world and make sense of the world through certain lenses and with a certain structurally embedded advantage. I also have brown skin and grew up in a white middle-class area where I was subjected to overt racism on the streets, in school, and in church. I left home at 16 and as a single mum, spent 5 years on a so-called notorious council estate. I first trained as a nurse and later went through the discernment process and trained for ordination. I was the only global majority woman in my year at college, and sometimes I felt this very acutely. I'm aware that I need to constantly interrogate my perceptions, learn and relearn myself. When people talked about me going to Moss Side, they talked about how I could do good, how I could help with food banks and so on. The social narrative of such places can become that the people there are poor, demotivated, dangerous, and in need of salvation. People, and because of my context, this was Christian church-going people and many clergy and ordinands, talked about the gang issues that happened in the early 1980s as if they were still the dominant narrative of the place. There was a sense of othering and distancing in some of the language. Most, if not all of these comments, came to me from my white middle-class colleagues and friends. They never mentioned the strong, vibrant community spirit, and they certainly never ever talked about the possibility of eco-mission. The reality of my lived experience and the lived experience of the community within which I work is that our dominant theological language silos the language of mission. The silos created house mission in specific ways, reflecting the understandings often rooted in the dominant narratives of white, Western, structurally embedded advantage and patriarchy that looks upon a community that is different from the accepted or the acceptable norm. Now, when I was at Theological College, I'll just see if I can move my, no, it's not wanting to move. Okay, when I was at Theological College, we of course did the 5 marks of Anglican mission, which I would show you if, there we go. And the 5 marks of mission express the Anglican communion's common commitment to understanding of God's holistic and integral mission. Now, whilst I recognise the simplicity of having 5 distinct marks, it's easier to grasp, to quote, to use. There are a few problems with this that I think feed into a limited hermeneutic of mission. It leads to essay questions, for example, being set where we're asked to pick a mark of mission and write about how you meet that in your context. And in doing this, we miss something fundamental about mission. We miss the holistic, integral aspect of mission. The intersectionality of mission is overlooked in favour of simplicity sometimes. And this allows space for some of our predisposed assumptions about place and class, which leads to assuming certain marks of mission apply in certain areas. In an urban working class deprived context, mission becomes about meeting human need with loving service, which in turn becomes about food banks, etc., through which we hope to share the good news. In leafy middle class contexts with lots of green spaces, praising, celebrating and conserving creation could be the dominant missional message through which we connect with people and share the good news. I'm exaggerating for effect, but not as much as one thinks. There's a large planting movement at the moment, and I've heard more than once that we, as in the church, are not reaching the poor middle class areas, and we need to plant churches there to attract people to our church. The language begins to sound colonial and elitist. Areas are much more than their demographic statistics. Eve talked so powerfully earlier about the power of storytelling. How often does theological education encourage the emergence of grassroots storytelling? Bodies tell the stories of oppression, but also of resistance, of community, of shared experience and meaning making. Back here in Moss Side, people had their own stories to tell. Here was the first public climate emergency meeting held in Moss Side, hosted by our church 2 months before the pandemic. It's hard to imagine having a meeting like that now. The place was packed full of people of all ages and backgrounds with stories to tell. They expressed their frustration over how the roads were car parks during the day, how the recycling system was so difficult to navigate. Here are examples of the many cobbled alleyways in Moss Side that residents have together transformed into communal gardens. You can see one of them is a plant made out of a bathtub. It's difficult to get rid of things when you don't have transport and little money. I know that when I entered Moss Side, I came with some perceptions of my own and with a sense of mission that was challenged and refreshed in this place that is now my spiritual home. I have had to deconstruct some of my dominant understandings of mission, break down some of the boxes that have suggested that mission in some places is one thing and in other places is another, and rebuild a deeper, intersectional, inclusive vision of mission. There's a quote quite often attributed to Rowan Williams that mission is about finding what God is doing and joining in. To participate in the Missio Dei is to be fully present in the place. But this is more complex than first imagined, because to be fully present, we must be prepared to interrogate our own embodied theologies and perceptions of power, class, race, and so on. Mission can be described as the outward energy of a group of contemporary disciples gathered as church to express the good news of Jesus Christ in word or deed, participating in the ongoing Missio Dei. This is communal, situational, working as the body of Christ. Earlier, I think Mike talked about in one of the early sessions about the gradients of power and cultures that affect how the body of Christ moves. Incarnational mission requires that attention is paid to the stories of the people who inhabit this place. So this isn't anything new. It's been said for decades. But do the pedagogies that we employ play to the dominant social constructs and ideologies that enhance structural inequality? I think in the keynote earlier, Professor Esther Mombo encouraged us to think about how our theologies reflect dominant power interests. Is the way that mission is approached shaped by structurally embedded power constructs? Are there spaces for stories, for people to tell the stories and the narratives of their lived body experience? Or, to fit a curriculum neatly, do we tidy theologies up, place them in boxes, determined by dominant ideologies? I could go on for a lot longer, but I'm conscious of time. But I think what I want to say is that when we think about mission and we think about theological education, it's really important that we interrogate the underpinning assumptions that shape our missional outlooks as individuals and as institutions. This is messier, it's more unpredictable, and it's less defined. But the Holy Spirit transcends the boxes we create. So that's my array of dishes that I present to you today. Some complement each other, some you may feel need to be served elsewhere or not at all. Some may need completely revisiting. As with most things, it's a work in progress, but I guess our pedagogies should always be that, works in progress, open to interrogation and new perspectives. So I welcome the post-meal discussion.